Akina was a young girl who'd grown up in rural Japan, and she'd just met Paul, a final-year architectural student. With the summer vacation coming up, she invited Paul to Japan to visit her native country with her. Following a long flight to Japan, they took a bus to her hometown, about 10 kilometers east of Osaka. On the way, Paul kept questioning Akina about her village, their local traditions, and history. His excited questions were as long as her answers were short. Traditionally, their cultures were as different as night and day. Paul was very outgoing, chatty, and curious, while Akina's eyes remained fixed, peering at the countryside and calmly listening to Paul. After the bus suddenly stopped on the side of a country road, Akina told Paul to politely get their bags from the bus. She talked about her village and how their traditions required that no motor vehicles were permitted beyond where they'd stop. Now they would complete the rest of the journey by foot, only minutes away, through a beautiful forest. Akina explained more about their traditions as they happily approached the ancient village where she'd grown up. In the distance, Paul was able to make out a village of very old, tiny homes built side by side. He could now recognize the feudal Japanese architecture from the Edo and Azuchi-Moyama periods. Paul had grown even more excited as Akina talked about how the newest of the homes were built in the 1860s, but the majority were far more ancient, built from stone and wood, with moss and algae covering the outside walls. The village wasn't very large. It was surrounded by thick woods, and it appeared as a completely different world. During the bus ride, Akina had introduced her village as a traditional village specialized in papermaking and silk weaving. Paul had listened, filled with admiration, and he felt extremely thankful and blessed to be part of this trip. As they walked deeper inside the village, Akina explained that every night the villagers would gather in large numbers on the streets and squares after their long day of work. This surprised Paul, who could only see empty streets, devoid of any soul. There weren't even any children playing around, which he found odd. But because he was afraid of offending Akina, he refrained from mentioning it. Akina led Paul down a narrow alley until they reached a peculiar little house at the end of the street. Paul was observing her with awe and admiration as she gently pushed the door open with her delicate hand. A rancid and moldy stench immediately wafted in their direction, causing Paul to sneeze. The room was dim. Paul could feel human presence, and this was confirmed by Akina bowing toward all sides of the room. Paul instinctively bowed as well, fully aware that this was the only efficient way of communicating with his foreign host. However, his greeting was only met with silence. Akina's relatives were sitting around a large danabi filled with steaming rice. Despite the darkness, he could see the steam coming out of the white, fluffy mound, but the surrounding relatives' faces were still blurry. Akina asked Paul to wait here for her return. As she walked out into an adjacent house, Paul felt all the more strange that only men, especially a middle-aged one, was greedily eating rice. Meanwhile, the remaining women just put their hands on their lap, apparently without any intention to eat. Paul was kneeling next to the door, waiting for Akina's return. The men continued to eat rice, more and more greedily. It appeared as if they'd been starved for a very long time. Out of curiosity, Paul decided to stand up and move closer to observe these peculiar, greedy hosts. But suddenly, he felt a strong arm clutching his shoulder. A short man was standing behind him, and he could see the side of his cold and grimacing face. Paul began looking around for Akina, hoping that she would end this uncomfortable, tense situation. When she finally came back, she was wearing a gorgeous peach-colored kimono. As she saw Paul's worried face, Akina laughed softly and introduced the menacing man as her father. She then smiled and squinted at Paul as if to comfort him. Gently taking his hand, she began pulling him towards the door. Because it was all so unexpected, Paul could only turn his head to look back a little bit, but wasn't able to see her family properly. Behind him, he could feel Akina's father staring at his shoulders. As he was turning around, Paul was startled to realize that all the relatives had turned around to look at him with grimacing faces and evil stares. The afternoon had begun, and as they were walking down the streets, the surroundings were becoming gloomier and gloomier. As if to bring instant relief, the lights from all the houses simultaneously lit up, and the town began filling up with villagers coming from all sides. Paul felt like he was the center of everyone's attention. He could sense the surrounding whirlwind. He didn't understand why, and how more and more people kept appearing from nowhere. Quite strangely, the town wasn't getting any noisier, as if the villagers were breathless ghosts whose steps didn't make any sound. The atmosphere was getting heavier by the minute, and Paul's guts were telling him something was wrong. He was hoping Akina would give him some sense of relief. Paul could not suppress his curiosity either. As he felt someone or something brushing briskly past him, Paul involuntarily turned his head back. What he saw next petrified him in horror. All of them were lifeless and walked extremely gently, as if they were gliding on the ground. Their limbs didn't move. Even their faces had no expression. Their soulless eyes didn't blink, and their mouths remained closed. In fact, their faces seemed to be made of white chalk, so much so that looking at anyone would make his cheeks blush. Paul shivered as he realized that men and women alike were blushing like dolls. As she saw Paul, Akina immediately led him back to her small room. And then she whispered in his ear that he shouldn't step out of the room after 7 p.m. or something terrible was about to happen. He was told to keep quiet and refrain from saying anything, and she would make him leave the island the following morning. At that moment, Paul started to feel that Akina was hiding something, and he watched her skeptically as she left. In the middle of the night, as he was falling into a deep sleep, Paul heard a loud noise outside and was immediately relieved by that powerful sound. People were real. There was life outside. All his fears from the afternoon were now gone. However, he found it strange that everyone was so noisy, so late, and raised the curtain slightly to look outside the window. The surrounding outside streets were crowded with people more or less gathered in a circle and laughing loudly. Deeply curious by nature, Paul completely forgot Akina's advice and sneaked out to get closer to the crowd. He quietly and carefully walked towards where the noise came from. Paul hid behind a large haystack and watched curiously. He then looked at the person standing in the middle of the crowd and realized that it was Akina's father, who was performing some sort of horrific ritual. Around him, the previously inanimate people were now grinning widely, all bearing terrifying looks on their faces, completely ignoring his surroundings and staring horror at Akina's father. Paul suddenly heard a hoarse laugh coming from behind him. Paul's face stiffened in fear. His mouth faltered, speechless, cold sweats trickling down his face. Behind him, the seemingly inanimate people he had met in the afternoon were now smiling and laughing with their mouths abnormally wide open, and all eyes were on him. Panicked and terrified, Paul ran up the main street to escape the crowd, and as he looked behind him to see if anyone was chasing him, he tripped on a cobblestone, falling face down on his stomach. As he lifted his head up, slightly buzzed, a familiar foot appeared in front of him. He began smiling, and as his gaze went up Akina's legs and torso, but it wasn't until he saw her face that he realized the truth in horror. Akina's beautiful eyes were staring at him eerily. Her wide yet crazy smile left him shocked and terrified, speechless. Akina made him stand up and started pointing her finger at him, as if signaling the ghostly villagers to gather around him in swarms, while she slowly stepped away. The following morning, the village square was now devoid of any soul. Its ground was scattered with a multitude of paper dolls, resembling a paper cemetery. In the distance, Akina's father bent down to pick up fragments of a doll, which, unlike the others, had been torn apart. His face remained expressionless as he played with them with his fat and hairy fingers. Akina walked out of the house, beaming and beautiful, and wearing a revealing dress. She purposely stepped on the remainders of the paper doll, at first smiling, until she started laughing hysterically. The aircraft was now landing slowly on the runway at Miyagi's port. As the plane doors opened, a pair of red stilettos stepped out of the cabin, shining in the bright daylight. Akina stepped down from the plane with a seductive smile on her face and whispered, "On to the next one. Let the show begin." Having said that, she smiled brightly again, her eyes glinting with an evil glare. My name is Bonnie. I'm currently working as a biological researcher, and I've been in charge of a project examining bats for almost 2 years now. I was assigned to work at Raymond's Research Institute. Raymond was a great scientist who was also a master of genetic mutation. However, some of his research had not been accepted because it was immoral and too bizarre. I recently discovered a big secret about him that almost put my life in danger. At the time, I was helping Raymond on a project, learning about the traits of a South American blood-sucking bat, whose eyes were damaged as he fell off a cliff near the cave where it was living. At one time, Raymond joked about whether there were any ways to create vampires from these blood-sucking bats. I was shocked by it. Raymond claimed that there had already been a lot of evidence about these types of bats sucking blood from many animals, and some of them turned more agile. Their strength and longevity were significantly increased. It amazes me to think where Raymond got this idea. A mutant bat that he had bought from the black market. The size of the bat was close to that of a man. He locked it inside a dark room and fed it rabbits, goats, even cows every day. Raymond began to study these bat genes. He wanted to combine them with human ones. Raymond said that if he could create a serum that allowed people to become stronger and live longer, then it might be worth a try. When I heard his idea, I thought to myself, it does sound interesting, but I had a bad feeling about him. Was Raymond's project really intended to be what he said it was? But the fact that he'd been raising a giant bat and feeding it daily was becoming more and more frightening. After some time, Raymond called me one day to come to his lab. He told me he'd successfully created a capsule that could cure cancer from the mutant bat. Needless to say, I was extremely curious and immediately went to the lab. When I arrived at Raymond's room, the door was unlocked. I pushed it open and went inside, but Raymond only stood there and smiled. He said that the drug was successfully tested on guinea pigs, and he was going to test it on himself. He wanted me to witness this wonderful moment with him. He told me that the drug would heal his damaged eye, as well as extending his life expectancy. Raymond laughed horrifically, then put the capsule in his mouth. A few seconds later, his face changed color. He collapsed and screamed in pain. I panicked when I saw what was happening to him. Raymond suddenly became insane. He rushed over to the bags of blood, which were already prepared, and drank them, his face looking terrified, like a monster. He looked in my eyes with a desperate gaze, and in a fraction of a second, he rushed me, grabbed my neck, pinning me to the floor. I tried pushing him away, but he was extremely strong. He tried to bite my neck. He had turned into a crazy madman. At that moment, I saw a syringe right next to me. I reached for it and stabbed it into his neck. He jerked back, screaming fiercely. I suddenly realized that the syringe that I had just stabbed into his neck was the drug he was working on. On the tube, these words were written: Experiment Trial 85 failed. It fell on the ground when Raymond accidentally dropped the box. My mind was becoming dizzy, and I couldn't figure out why I had this feeling. But as I look back, another syringe was being stabbed into my thigh. I pulled it out and just held it in my hand, seeing the line saying, Experiment 101 failed. My whole body started to ache badly. Then I heard the call of a security guard. After, I fell asleep, knowing nothing. After being in a coma for 3 days, I woke up and saw the police. They were next to me at my side, asking me if I felt good enough to answer some questions related to Dr. Raymond. They told me that Raymond was on the list of suspects that caused many deaths in the city in the past few days. The victims' blood was all sucked from their body as they died. Raymond's fingerprints were left on the victim's neck at the scene of the crime. I was so horrified. Did Raymond succeed with his experiments? Or did he lie about working on an anti-cancer drug, but secretly created one to help him to become a vampire? Washington, USA, Friday the 13th. Ooh, hello. It's me again, Iris, a normal taxi driver who somehow always encounters weird things. Today, I have another story to write in my work diary. As you may have guessed, just like any other taxi driver, I don't really want to serve drunk passengers. I'm sick and tired of having to clean their vomit up all the time. But as you know, my old car that was beyond repair. Remember those monstrous monkeys that destroyed my car? But that was some time ago. I was thinking about looking for another job, but eventually I decided to keep on working as a taxi driver because I really like the work, and somehow I feel like I was born to be a taxi driver. I had to borrow some money to buy myself a new car, and now I had to work 2 times as hard. No, 3 times harder to earn enough money to pay off my debt and support my wife and children. I started to gradually ignore my own rules. Lately, I have been serving drunk passengers, as they were more likely to give me better tips, which means more income and a happier life. And things were just getting more stable now. But somehow, something terrible happened to me again. It was a day when I only had a few customers. I parked my car by the side of the road at noon, and by 5 p.m., I still had not received any rides. I got back to the car with the intention of going home early and call it a day. And then suddenly, a young man with a wobbly gait rushed to the front of my car. Man, that startled me, and I slammed on the brake pedal. What kind of an idiot would rush in front of my car like that? For a minute, I felt frozen. I guess the fright from that idiot just forced me to take a little time out and think for a second. I took a deep breath. When that young man quickly moved to the back of the car, hitting the car door repeatedly, telling me to unlock the door. As I looked at him, I could only whisper to myself, what an unlucky day. I couldn't get any taxi rides the whole afternoon, and now I have to deal with the drunk bastard right when I was about to go home. When he got in my car, even after I asked him what his destination was, he still did not answer me. He just sat there with his head down. He must have been too drunk. I was trying to ask him again when he suddenly went crazy. His whole body began convulsing violently, and then unexpectedly, he rushed to the driver's seat and attacked me. He bit me on the neck, and I quickly grabbed the cane from under my feet and hit him as hard as I could over the head. And then I opened the door and rushed out, screaming for help. The guy became even more angry after that sudden blow. He rushed out and chased after me, looking like a madman. The way he ran didn't look like a normal person at all. Very crooked, like a bloodthirsty zombie. The only difference was he looked extremely agile. As I was looking behind me, I accidentally stumbled over a rock and fell onto the street. I was still struggling on the road when he caught up and rushed towards me like a crazy man. He was only 3 steps away from me when he exposed his teeth and jumped towards me. The only thing I could do under that circumstance was to close my eyes and pray. But right at that moment, I suddenly heard a loud noise. It turned out that he was hit by a car on the road. The female driver panicked and got out of the car. I slowly got up, and with the help of the other girl, we approached him to check if he was all right. Dreadfully, the man had stopped breathing. The girl began to panic even more and cried as she thought she killed the person. I noticed the smell of alcohol coming out of her body. However, while the 2 of us were not paying attention, that crazy guy suddenly jumped up, glaring with his crazy red eyes, and hypnotized us. that moment, I could only take the girl's hand and run. But an awful thing happened. We had been running for quite a while when I suddenly heard a cry from behind. And when I looked back, oh my God, I almost fainted. What I was holding was just the arm separated from the girl's body. And in the distance, I could see the man frantically biting the girl, just like a cannibal. Being so scared out of my mind, I kept running without even looking back. I was so terrified. I tried my best to run to the main road, wave my hands to call for help. When drivers on the road stopped and asked me what had happened, they were under the impression that I had been robbed. Me, together with 3 other men, headed back to the scene, but found out that the zombie guy was gone. The girl's corpse was nowhere to be seen. There was just a piece of white cloth left. I assumed that it was from the dress of the girl. I told everything that I could remember to the police, but until now, there has been no new information about the case. Absolutely no clue about the zombie-like man that I described. The owner of the car at the scene was declared missing. I think that the man took the girl's body deep into the woods. At night, he would appear in deserted places to start searching for another prey. Are you ready to get scared? I shouldn't even be alive because I was in such a horrible accident. This is a story that I've encountered, and up to this day I cannot forget this scary event. Well, at the time this happened, it was in the fall. I had a long day at school. Outside the school gate, it was still crowded with cars and people. Large trucks just rolled by as normal. And one truck was carrying wild animals to the zoo and accidentally caused a terrible accident. The truck's rear tire suddenly exploded, creating a loud noise that shook everything that surrounded it. The truck lost control and crashed straight into the school gate and flipped. If things just ended there, I guess there wouldn't be much worth mentioning. Since the truck door at the end of the truck was heavily hit, it accidentally swung open, and 2 ferocious lions from South Africa disappeared into the bushes without a trace. When the transport officer found out about their disappearance, it was already too late. They fled into the gates of my school. At that time, I was in my biology class. As soon as I was called by the teacher to answer the question, the fire alarm started ringing loudly. It startled everyone. A fire broke out on the first floor. Because of the many chemical laboratories nearby, it easily caught fire and burned ferociously. Fire and smoke covered the entire first floor, as well as the emergency staircase. All of the students in our class were studying on the second floor, so we couldn't escape in time. Professor Charlie tried to lead us to another way out, but we failed. Because the space of my school was extremely enclosed, and it was surrounded with so many glass windows. The smoke coming from the first floor rising into our classrooms on the second floor. The fire was picking up speed and terribly hard for us to breathe. We were all scared, screaming and not knowing what to do. The professor quickly divided our class into 3 small groups and assigned me to manage a group of 8 people. It was my responsibility to find the best and safest escape routes. As we tried to run to the foot of the stairs, we immediately ran into a large lion. It was a male lion, and its teeth were sharp and big. When we saw it, we all began panicking and screaming loudly, looking for a way to escape. So we used books, bags to throw at the lion, some decoy, but the lion kept advancing. I know the lion seemed to be injured, so it couldn't move as fast. We tried our best to get out of there. Unfortunately, it was only our classroom that was left open, and because on that day, it was only my class that had a lecture with Professor Charlie, so we had no other option but to get back inside our own classroom. As you might guess at that moment, and if you could only see what we were facing, this was a difficult situation. We had to find a way to fight off that lion while trying to escape these flames from the fire on the first floor. The 8 of us desperately tried to get back into our classroom. We were all so afraid, none of us dared to look behind us until we heard a girl scream. It was Lena. A gory-filled scene appeared right in front of my eyes. The lion fiercely pounced on her. It roared savagely, scratched and knocked her to the ground, making Lena lose consciousness. We were all horrified to realize that we couldn't save her anymore. So we ran straight into the classroom. I panicked, looked around for items to fight off that lion. This was a killer lion. Then seeing the ventilation duct on the ceiling, I immediately told my friends to get in there to hide. Others got into large drawers at the end of the classroom. We quickly tried to find a place that we could hide from the beast. At that moment, I was the only one not looking for another place to hide, because there was no time for me to do it. My duty now was to protect, so I couldn't run away. The lion would definitely not leave them alone, and I had to do something. And then I could see the lion's figure appear in the front of the room. He sniffed around frantically, and he moved really fast. The lion then slowly approached me with a loud growl and a terrifying echo. I went into a corner of the room. I raised the fire extinguisher to fight that lion. It didn't hesitate to rush toward me. It hit that lion right smack in the middle of his face, and then it fell to its side. But afterwards, it didn't do much harm. The lion just got back up, regained his balance, and continued roaring angrily at me. This time, its claws and teeth were revealed as it wanted to attack and bite off my head. I continued to hold the fire extinguisher, bent over, and dodged its swing. And this time, the lion failed to attack me, but he ran into a table instead. Again, the lion didn't give up. He came right back at me, turned his head, and raised its claws to scratch me. Since the lion moved so fast, I couldn't dodge it. Again, he attacked me, clawing me and biting me. I was bleeding all over. I held on to that fire extinguisher tightly as I could, while my arm continued bleeding and blood running out of my body. All my friends were hiding safely. Perhaps they were amused at watching me fight the lion. I understand that they were all terrified. I was bleeding like crazy. I felt dizzy, exhausted, and unable to stand any longer. When the lion was about to rush toward me again, it felt like I was about to die. My life flashed before my eyes, and suddenly I understood the reason my friends were watching is because they were terrified. The lion just kept prowling around, and another person threw a chair at it. But it was not just one person. It was my 3 friends. I must say, they were brave warriors, willing to give up their hiding places for me, and even put their life in danger. The lion ignored me. It slowly turned its anger on the 3 of them, and at that moment, the 3 of them divided into separate positions, in turn throwing any object they could find at the lion. The lion seemed to be in pain. It took a few steps back and gasped for breath. Meanwhile, we were trying to think of ways to fight it off. We immediately took action without making any mistakes. When the lion came rushing at Emma and about to attack her, I immediately used the fire extinguisher to spray it off, which made the lion lose its eyesight for a while. It staggered around and roared. Its body was covered with white foam. It was impossible for the lion to see things clearly, and with no time left, the fire began spreading to the 2nd floor, and many more classrooms were on fire. The only fire extinguisher we had was damaged. So Rose quickly ran around looking for another. This was a moment between life and death. How could we put this blazing fire, out with no fire extinguisher? It was time to figure out how we could survive now, and we had to make good use of every gesture and every thought. Faced with such a critical situation, Dan came up with the idea of closing our room. All of us would stay inside. Pinky hurriedly opened all the classroom windows, and I hurried to use the phone to call the firefighters to rescue us through these windows. We were completely surrounded by flames, and they were quickly reaching our classroom. Smoke and ash rose up in the room. We were so exhausted, it was difficult to breathe. I was beginning to wonder if we were ever going to make it out of here. We felt certain we were going to die. I rushed to the window and looked around. Luckily, the members of a fire brigade and the teachers had arrived and prepared the mattresses, shouting at us to jump down quickly. Without hesitation, I told my friends to climb out of the window, and I helped them to jump down one by one until they all landed safely. I tried to observe the surrounding, but I couldn't see the lion anywhere. So I immediately thought of Lena. I had to save her. I ran out of the room and cautiously walked towards Lena. She was still unconscious as her head had hit the floor and her hand was still bleeding heavily from the lion's bite. I struggled to get Lena back to the room and headed toward the window. As I looked back, I saw the lion getting exhausted and out of breath, laying at the end of the hallway. After the rescuers had helped Lena to land safely, I quickly jumped out. The whole school was blocked from all areas. According to the reports, there was still another female lion in the school. After the investigation, it was discovered that the fire was caused by a lion biting off the electrical wires, causing the sparks to spread to other classrooms, especially in the laboratory. That was the female lion, and it died from the shock when it bit the transmission line. After that unfortunate incident, we understood that lions were not the ones to blame. It was the people who had invaded their natural habitat and forced them to enter into a zoo. The most feared ones of all are not the predatory beasts, but look around. We are the biggest enemy. My name is Alex. I'm currently in my senior year at high school. Despite participating in many outside activities, I still have enough credit points to graduate. And the celebration day that all high school students had been looking forward to, the graduation ceremony, had turned out to be an unforgettable mess. That day, while the principal was on the podium giving a speech, the chemistry teacher suddenly burst in through the door at the end of the hall with a long wire in his hand, looking angry. Immediately after that, white, thin air began gushing out from a pipe. The large hall quickly got filled up with smoke. The solemn atmosphere of the ceremony was instantly interrupted. No one knew what kind of gas it was. Everyone just panicked and tried to get out. The problem was that all the doors in the hall had been locked somehow. People began to cough uncontrollably. Some fainted from breathing in too much gas. The remaining students, parents, and teachers got out of control after inhaling the gas. They were dancing and laughing like crazy. Not only that, this gas also brought out the worst personalities of everyone. Some students began dancing, cursing, and tearing up books. The teachers also lost their calm demeanor and acted out of character. But the most shocking scene was the image of the principal getting naked, covering his private parts with a cotton vase, and doing a provocative dance. And the infamously furious school supervisor suddenly cried out like a baby, running around the hall in his flowered shorts. Everything was recorded on camera that was supposed to record the ceremony and broadcasted live on the school's fan page. The scene at that moment was completely chaotic. With the essential skills that I had, I quickly picked up a handkerchief to cover my nose. Then I lowered my body, got to the locker, and put on a gas mask. After ensuring that I was totally safe, I followed the line and quickly figured out where the gas was coming from. It turned out that the chemistry teacher had driven a gas truck to the school, a kind of gas that would make anyone who inhales it hallucinate. He was the one that had secretly locked all the doors of the hall and polluted the hall with that gas in order to attack all the students and teachers there. Immediately after finding the cause, I quickly locked the duck valve of the truck. Not just that, I also found out that the chemistry teacher was busy climbing out on the 5th floor balcony. It looked like he was about to commit suicide. I rushed to his position where he was standing. Despite knowing that he was the one who released the poisonous gas into the hall and ruined the ceremony, I still tried to calm him down and talk to him. It was because of the fact that he was fired from his job for speaking out against the school due to the corruption in organizing examinations. Feeling resentful, he came up with a plan for revenge and then wanted to commit suicide. He was thinking recklessly. Since he wasn't married and had no kids and was now unemployed, he had no reason to keep on living. The gas was made up of some compounds that caused hallucinations. He didn't deliberately want to harm people. He just wanted the graduation ceremony to turn out chaotic so that the police would do an investigation to help him regain justice. Hearing his confession, I tried my best to advise him to do the right thing, and by the end, as he didn't notice, I grabbed him and pulled him backward to safety. After the teacher was saved, and by his act of carelessness, he had his teacher's degree permanently suspended and was sentenced to do public service. As for the school, the police had conducted an investigation and found out the scandals of the organization for exams. Some officials and teachers were suspended, but as for me, it was the most unforgettable graduation ceremony ever.